Hello and welcome to this discussion with Professor Samir Okasha at the Madras Complexity Collective. We will focus this discussion on evolution, emergence, and levels of selection. We will begin with one of the central questions in evolutionary biology. At what level does selection actually operate? Does it only operate at the genetic level, or are there other levels of aggregation where it could operate? We will also speak about the problem of emergence in this context. How do we actually know that selection is happening at a higher level versus happening at a lower level and then the effects percolating up? Finally, we will speak about the evolution of altruism in humans and how multi-level selection offers us a way to think about this unlikely characteristic emerging and persisting in human populations. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy this conversation. Just first of all, thank you so much. Welcome to this discussion at the Madras Complexity Collective. I was just saying that I had read your book on evolution and levels of selection, a few years back. One of the things that I was very interested in at that point of time, and still remains something that I read about, is the issue of the emergence of altruism in human beings, right? And levels of selection seems to be an important part of trying to get a sense of how we come to being altruistic. In general, my interest has been in studying social systems, particularly cities. And really, a lot of my work has been in using models of complexity and networks and trying to understand, the city as a system. So that's sort of the background. I read this work. I really enjoyed it. I felt, it was, it just gave me a lot to think about at that point in time. And, now there's an opportunity to actually have a discussion with you on some of the, key themes that you sort of discuss in that book, which of course is a compilation of a lot of your research over the years. So, one of the things maybe to get started with, because I spoke about levels of selection. It might be useful to take a step back and talk about what that actually means, in the sense that, the central question is in sort of one of the central questions in evolutionary biology is what level does, natural selection actually operate on? Is it genes? Is it cells? Is it organisms? Is it something else? Or does it operate at one level or many levels, right? And if you could just get us started off with a broad sort of, lay of the land of the key sort of debates in the space, that would be a great.
Yeah, this expression levels of selection has been defined in more than one way, and as has the related expression units of selection. But as I see it, then the clearest way to set it up is to reflect on is to start from the point that the basic requirements for evolution by natural selection can be stated entirely abstractly without reference to any level of hierarchical organization or any particular sort of biological object, or even any biology at all. We just say, suppose we have a population of things which vary from one another, and where that variation is correlated with differences in survival or rate of reproduction, then we can expect that population to change over time. And the question then arises, well, what are those things that form that population? So in Darwin's original treatment, of course, those were individual organisms, what we often just call individuals, such as, for example, multicelled plants or animals or microbes, perhaps. Those were the entities which varied and which formed the population whose composition changed as a result of differential survival or reproductive success. But as was long recognized, and indeed by Darwin himself, in principle, those entities might be something else. So one could imagine a situation where we had a large population containing groups of individuals, and where some of the groups, for some reason or other, systematically do better than another sort of the group. And in that situation, we would have what's sometimes called group level selection, where the entities undergoing selective competition, if you like, are not individual organisms, but groups. So the general idea of levels of selection is that in principle, one might find natural selection operating at different levels of hierarchical organization. So if you think of biological entities, roughly speaking, as forming some sort of a hierarchy, where at the smallest scale, we might have genes or subgenic constituents, perhaps even nucleotides. And at the largest scale, we might find entities such as species or perhaps ecosystems. That's a familiar idea, although I think one that we in fact need to scrutinize quite carefully. That's the idea that biological entities form some kind of a hierarchy, with smaller ones nested inside larger ones, in the way that cells, say, are nested within multi-celled organisms. So if you combine that idea of hierarchical organization with the fact that the requirements for Darwinian evolution are entirely abstract, then we arrive at this potential thought that natural selection could in principle operate at more than one level of the biological hierarchy, and it presumably becomes an empirical question what level it does operate at. I say presumably because although that sounds simple, in fact, much of the discussion has involved around levels and units of selection has involved people talking past each other, and people conceptualizing the issue in slightly different ways, with the result that it's really not always obvious whether what's at stake is an empirical issue to be resolved by ordinary scientific investigation, or a conceptual issue, which was part of my interest in it as a philosopher of science, because it's precisely that intersection of the empirical and conceptual that calls for, in some cases at least, philosophical style analysis to basically ask the question, well, what do we all really mean here? I was going to say I could say a little bit more about levels of selection. A slightly different way of getting at the issue is to ask something like this. I mean, most of the traits or phenotypic attributes of organisms seem to have evolved because they're beneficial to the organism. So think of stick insects, amazing matching of the background foliage. I mean, why does it match the background foliage? Well, that makes it invisible to predators, to birds, and so confers a survival advantage. And those, in the simple cases of Darwinian explanation, the survival advantage of some phenotypic trait is conferred on the organism or individual that has the trait. But we sometimes find examples of traits, particularly behaviors, in biology, where it seems that the behavior is not advantageous and possibly even disadvantageous to the individual expressing it. And altruistic behavior is a case in point. And it poses an immediate question. Why is it that this trait persists in the population if it's actually harmful to the bat? Surely refusing to exhibit the altruistic behavior might be more advantageous. And this immediately raises the question of whether the advantage might be accruing at some other level of hierarchical organization. So if an older idea, although largely discredited these days, is that some phenotypic traits of individuals might be beneficial for the species, and that's why they're there. And when I say discredited, I mean, it's not that the discredited bit is not that they're beneficial for the species. They could be in some sense, but the idea that that's why they're there. So ordinarily we think that to give a valid Darwinian explanation of the existence or maintenance of some phenotypic trait in a population, we have to prove advantage of the trait for the individual organism, not for some larger unit such as the species to which that organism belongs. Any such benefit at that level is incidental. And we can illustrate that point by the following example. Consider an earthworm burrowing through the soil. Suppose that a naturalist observes that the earthworm has this incredible physiology that enables it to burrow through the soil. Remarkable physiological adaptations that enable it to do that. and then wonders why that is. Right? Why does it have that? And consider the following hypothetical answer. Suppose the naturalist says to themselves, well, by burrowing through the soil, the earthworm aerates the soil, and that's beneficial for microbes that live in the soil, and that enhances the plants that live there, and so provides a benefit to the local ecosystem. Now, all of that is true. The earthworm's burrowing does have that effect, but that's not why they do it. Right. To understand that feature from a Darwinian point of view, we would ordinarily think you need to show the advantage to the earthworm, not to the local ecosystem of which the earthworm is a small part. Precisely because selection occurred, we think, at the level of the individual organism here. It was earthworms against earthworms, if you like, to put it crudely, that led to the evolution of this physiological adaptation, the burrowing through the soil. And so therefore, to understand that today, in terms of its evolutionary advantage, we need to posit evolutionary advantage at the right level, at the same level as the level at which selection took place. Now, obviously, if selection had taken place differently, if it had been local ecosystem against local ecosystem, then we might indeed expect to see attributes of earthworms that were beneficial for local ecosystems. But we tend to think that that isn't how natural selection operated, or operates most of the time. And so therefore, that hypothetical explanation of the earthworms, the adaptive advantage of the earthworms burrowing in terms of benefit to the local ecosystem is incorrect.
Right.
So that's broadly speaking where these issues arise of levels of selection in evolutionary biology.
I thought it was interesting when you said that often the way that these, let's call them debates, are structured is by, positing that there is kin selection, or there is group selection, or there's gene level selection. I think what you're saying is that, depending upon the context, you could have any or all of these operating depending upon, where what the condition is. Is that correct? Is that
partially? Hi, sorry. Yeah, so you mentioned gene level selection. Now, one idea is that the contrast between gene level of selection and selection at any other hierarchical level is not really a contrast of empirical hypotheses, but rather just a difference between possible ways of viewing or modeling the evolutionary process. The point being that selection at any hierarchical level presumably ultimately gives rise to changes in the genetic composition of populations. So in a sense, we can understand all of evolution if we want, or try to, in terms of competition between genes, between alleles at a single genetic locus for representation in the future gene pool. So one way to express that is to say that, gene level selection isn't a hypothesis to be contrasted empirically with selection at the level of the individual organism or selection at the level of the group, because those different processes, selection at those levels, ultimately give rise to change in gene frequency. And this, I think, was something that Richard Dawkins came to realize in his second book, after The Selfish Gene, his second book, The Extended Phenotype, where he makes this distinction between the genes being replicators and organisms and groups being so-called vehicles, precisely to get at the point that the contrast between gene and individual is sort of logically dissimilar to the contrast between individual and group.
Right.
When it comes to selection.
Right. So what I was saying was that, I think this brings us to this notion of emergence in the levels of selection question, right? So given the possibility that selection can happen or operate at multiple levels, right? Can we actually distinguish in cases where, the real selection is happening at a higher level versus cases where, selection is happening at some lower level and the effects are sort of,
Yeah.
percolating up the hierarchy, right? Generating the appearance of higher level selection. So how do we sort of, I know this is a
Yeah.
question that you in great detail, so lovely to hear about
Yeah.
how you think.
I think it's a tricky question. I mean, I think I would say in principle, there is a difference. That's between natural selection at one level leading to effects at a different hierarchical level, typically a higher one, without natural selection operating at that higher level itself, and cases where natural selection does operate at that higher level itself. I think I would say that in principle, there is a difference because those constitute different causal hypotheses about what the process is driving phenotypic and genetic evolution were. One of them posits that it was earthworm against earthworm driving this evolutionary change, and the other posits know that it was ecosystem against ecosystem, if you like. And those are in principle different hypotheses. We may not be able to tell, and they could lead to outcomes that are empirically similar or even perhaps indistinguishable. But in principle, if we think of hypotheses about natural selection as causal claims about the influence of certain phenotypic attributes or traits on survival and reproductive success, then those do constitute distinct causal hypotheses, albeit ones that it might be very difficult to tell apart. So I think I would come down on the side of those who would say, in response to this question, is there really a difference between selection at one level having effects that perlocate up the biological hierarchy and selection operating at that higher level? I would say, yes, there is a difference in principle, in that we are making competing causal hypotheses about what happened in the evolutionary past, about the causal origins of differential survival and reproduction. And even if we can't tell, then there is a fact of the matter out there, if you like.
Right. I actually wanted to sort of, dig a little bit deeper there. In the book, you speak about, multi-level selection 1 and 2 as two different models of this of what we just discussed. And I was particularly interested in the sort of analytical tools that you also use to explore or to try and understand, these evolutionary processes. One was, of course, the price equation, which is, I think, fairly well known, as an approach that allows us, in some sense, to formally separate levels of selection in this context. But I guess it could be used across contexts to separate many different things. And the other thing which I actually learned from your book was contextual analysis, which you said is a method from the social sciences, where where all objects in a collective have not just their individual properties, but also some collective character, which is a contextual property of the object. Right? And you sort of go ahead and you apply both these frameworks to what you call MLS1 and MLS2, which is selection happening at a higher level versus versus percolating upward. I mean, I know this is slightly a tricky question to answer in a question answer like this, but I was wondering, like, if you could speak about the applicability of these frameworks to the question that you were looking to answer, and how do we understand this? Are they just different descriptors of the same process? Does it allow, or do these methods allow us to get at a true level of selection, or does that even just remain sometimes undeterminable, even with data? I'm sorry, it's sort
even
of
in principle.
question.
Yeah,
exactly.
I mean, it's a tricky question, because one of the interesting, I think, philosophically interesting features of this debate about units and levels of selection is that one finds, in some cases, a controversy, for example, between advocates of kin selection on the one hand and advocates of group selection on the other. that on the face of it appears to be an empirical controversy about what goes on in the world, about causal processes occurring in the world, but then one finds other people in the controversy, in the debate, arguing that these are equivalent, and indeed in some cases claiming to have proven that they're different ways of saying the same thing. So are alternative perspectives on a single underlying selection process rather than alternative empirical hypotheses, which is rather confusing. I mean, surely it's got to be one or other. It can't be both. But the resolution of the question of that confusion really is that people have used the phrase group selection in this case in rather different ways. And so if you use it in one way, then it basically does become equivalent to kin selection. Those are different modeling approaches for capturing the same reality. But if you use it in a somewhat different way that also has a historical precedent, it constitutes a separate empirical hypothesis about what happened in nature. So you started, Anna, by talking about this distinction between multi-level selection type 1 and type 2. So this was something which I didn't come up with myself, I should emphasize, but is a distinction that had been captured in different ways in the literature the time when I was writing, and I thought was an important logical distinction. And essentially the distinction is this. I mean, if you think of this idea, the idea that we started with, that selection might operate not on individual organisms, but on groups, one can make a distinction between cases in which reproduction happens at the level of the individual organisms. Mm-hmm. And the groups are sort of units of ecological interaction, roughly speaking. So the individuals live in groups, their fates depend on the group in which they live, and some of those groups do better than others as a consequence of, in part, of the individual behaviors of the individuals in them. However, although there's a genuine selection between groups, some prosper, some don't, some go extinct, some survive and go on to colonize other ones, then the reproduction is happening at the level of the individual organism. It's not the groups in any sense are reproducing. However, in other versions of the group selection hypotheses, the idea precisely is that an analog of the process of reproduction is indeed going on at the higher group level. And so one example that illustrates this is the hypothesis that Stephen Jay Gould and others in the 1970s advanced, that they call species level selection or species selection. And this posited that over geological time, over macroevolutionary time periods, there was a selective process went on between species in which some species would go extinct and others would survive and split. And that's give rise to daughter species, where that was meant to be the analog of asexual reproduction by organisms, but over a completely different time scale, if you like. And that hypothesis that macroevolution had been shaped by species level selection, whether or not it's true, has a fundamentally different logical status to the sort of group selection that many people interested in, say, altruistic behavior had been talking about, where they weren't envisaging a process of reproduction at the level of groups. Rather, the groups were the units within which the individual reproducing organisms lived. So that's the basic distinction between type 1 and type 2 multi-level selection.
Right.
Yeah, then you mentioned the price equation business. So this is a rather unusual formalism in evolutionary biology, named after a maverick scientist called George Price, who was working in London in the 60s and 70s, and it came to a tragic end. But I mean, what Price did, in effect, was nothing really to do with levels of selection per se, but to design a very abstract formalism for describing any evolutionary process, which, although in a way rather trivial, and it's just a matter of notation, nonetheless succeeds in helping us see the different components of the evolutionary process, helping us separate the total evolutionary change into components that in some cases will correspond to different evolutionary processes or pressures or forces. And And so one use of the price equation that you mentioned that was really due to W.D. Hamilton, the Oxford biologist in the 70s, was to suggest that it could be used to illustrate multi-level selection, although the germ of this idea was in Price himself, that it would allow us to split the total evolutionary change into components reflecting selection at different hierarchical levels. So that's the reason for that many people have thought that this is a useful formalism. But obviously, a formalism can only go so far, and I mean, the price equation really is all about correlations or covariance between phenotypic attributes and some fitness components, such as survival, for example. And the existence of such a correlation at whatever hierarchical level obviously doesn't tell us anything about whether the correlation is directly causal. I mean, is it the case, like any correlation, it may or may not reflect a direct causal link between the two variables. And since the levels of selection question, as I see it, is ultimately a question about causality, because different hypotheses about how natural selection works constitute different causal hypotheses, causal claims about what happened in nature, it's impossible in principle that some formalism could itself resolve that matter. However, I did think and that it could play a clarificatory role in helping us see what exactly people are talking about and helping us separate the areas of empirical uncertainty and disagreement from the conceptual matters. So that was my reason for drawing on that widely used formalism. That and its enormous generality, in that it lends itself to a quite general description of any evolving system.
Yeah. I was also a little curious. This actually was in one of your papers where you speak about emergence in this context. Now, in general, I think as complexity scientists, we are constantly looking for, what are those features that are common to emergence across systems? What are those abstract, underlying or abstract principles underlying emergence? And I thought what was interesting about your paper was, you said that emergence in this context of the levels of selection, that it was not a specific instance of any general or abstract property of emergence, but that it pertains specifically to, to matters of evolutionary science, right? So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to that, as to...
Yeah. I mean, so the argument I was making in that paper concerned essentially what we were talking about a moment ago, namely this distinction between cases where selection at one level, for example, at the level of the individual organism, produces effects that perlocate up the biological hierarchy, with cases where selection is acting at that higher level itself. And it had sometimes been suggested in the evolutionary literature on this question at the time in which I was writing, that this distinction corresponded somehow to a distinction between so-called emergent and aggregate attributes. So these were meant to be properties of groups or collections, where an emergent one is meant to be, roughly speaking, something that's fundamentally different from the properties or the attributes of the constituent organisms within the collective or units within the collective, whereas an aggregate one is meant to just be some simple average or something of the. So if you take, for example, the average height of the people in some local population, for example, then there's a clear sense in which that, although it is an attribute of the collective, not of any individual, nonetheless it exhibits a trivial definitional dependence on attributes of the individuals. Contrast that with something like the extent of division of labor within an insect colony or something. I mean, that clearly is a real feature of the whole. And some people have thought that that has a fundamentally different status to some aggregate attribute, like the number of insects in the colony or something. And so what I was trying to do was to cast doubt on the idea that this contrast, interesting though it is, really maps in any natural way onto the contrast between selection at one level having effects that perlocate up, and selection occurring at that higher level. So this is the reason that I was trying to caution against the idea that the appeal to the notion of emergence in the levels of selection debate indicates that we're dealing with an instance of the more general question of emergence that arises, say, in complexity science or in thinking about the relation between fundamental physics and chemistry or something like that, where it's common to invoke this idea that we have emergent phenomena at the higher level. And I think, I don't know if you would agree with this as a complexity scientist, but my sense is that although it's a useful label, it's not particularly sharply defined. And it tends to often be defined in sort of epistemic terms, where we say things like, oh, we couldn't have predicted that effect from knowledge of the lower level behaviors or something. And I was trying to caution against the idea that all of that cluster of interesting scientific and philosophical issues surrounding what emergence is, how we should study it, what an emergent phenomenon is, what corresponded exactly to what was going on in the areas of the levels of selection where appeals had been made to emergence. If that makes sense.
No, it does. And, and you're absolutely right that often when we speak about emergence in the abstract, we often do say things like, it's novel behavior or,
Right.
unpredicted sort of outcomes given what we know about the details of the system, et cetera, right? Or we say things like, what is essential for emergence is interaction amongst the individual objects in the system and things like that. So I
Exactly.
take your point. While that is interesting in and of itself as a set of ideas to explore, but it doesn't offer us any something robust to build on in some sense, I guess, scientifically.
Right. And I was also motivated by the thought that although certainly we find emergent features in that sense all over biology, I mean, clearly many features of organisms are emergent with respect to the cells and tissues that they contain. Cells themselves are incredibly complex entities that exhibit features that are emergent with respect to the smaller structures, the subcellular structures and the chromosomes and genes that they contain. So emergence in that sense is certainly everywhere in biology, but much of the time we tend to think of that emergence as the result of evolution by natural selection because it's closely connected with adaptive complexity. Many of those emergent features, though perhaps not all, but many of them seem to correspond to features that are adaptive and so have been honed by natural selection. But then it seems to me, if one accepts that, it would be a mistake to build emergence into the preconditions needed for evolution by natural selection, because then one would face an immediate chicken and egg problem. And indeed, the discussion of levels of selection has often featured this sort of logical unsatisfactoriness in that people have tried to formulate what must be true, say, for a process of group level selection to operate by saying things like, oh, the groups have to have emergent features with respect to their constituent organisms, because otherwise it's just organism level selection. But you see, group level emergent features, one would think would result from a process of group level selection. So shouldn't be preconditions for it. That was another part of the argument I was making here, that it seems that if we build the requirement of emergence into the conditions that we take to be logically necessary for natural selection to operate at a given hierarchical level, then there's a bit of a puzzle about how entities at that level could ever come to exhibit these emergent features, given that they appear to be adaptive themselves.
Right. No, absolutely. I wanted to, also talk a little bit about in evolutionary history, we've had these major sort of, evolutionary transitions, right? Whether it's from genes to chromosomes or single to multicellular organisms. And in all of these cases, the transitions happen when, when lower level units sort of form a higher level organism, right? And importantly, I guess it shifts the level at which selection now happens, right? So I guess given an understanding of multi-level selection and these levels of selection. Why
Mm.
would lower level units give up the autonomy to form this higher level organism? Is there a rationale for
Yeah.
that?
No, it's a good question. So you mentioned here, and the notion of evolutionary transition, or sometimes called major transition. So this notion came into popularity in the 90s, largely, though not solely, as a result of work by John Maynard Smith and Seth Mary in their book, The Major Transitions in Evolution, and related work by others, including the evolutionary biologist Rick Michaud, who talked about evolutionary transitions in individuality. And the broad idea, although people characterize these transitions slightly differently, the broad idea was that in many of them, or perhaps all, what went on was we had free living individual entities that somehow or other gave up their free living way of life, coalesced into a larger unit that then became the new individual, if you like. Individual in scare quotes there, of course. So a paradigm example of this is the transition that's believed to have happened many, many times from single-celled eukaryotes to multi-celled organisms like ourselves, which is, as I say, I think something over 20 times that transition is believed to have occurred. And it immediately raises this question. I mean, how could we understand this from a Darwinian point of view? I mean, how could I mean, if we thought altruistic behavior was puzzling enough, I mean, this seems even bizarrer, that an entity would cease to give up its individuality or its free living lifestyle altogether and become so integrated into a collective that it ceases to really be able to function alone and may indeed cease to be able to reproduce at all, or certainly without the help of its collective members. But that's what seemed to happen precisely with the transition to multicellularity, so that cells in the soma, in the body of a multi-celled organism, they are destined to leave no descendants in evolutionary time. I mean, they can divide sometimes within the lifespan of their organism, but they're destined to leave no descendants as they die. That their cell lineage dies when their host organism dies. And yet they're descendants of cells that once lived freely, we know, many millions of years ago. So how could this have happened? And this seems to raise a version of the levels of selection question, but interestingly, a sort of diachronic version of it, in that we're not saying, how does natural selection operate now? But we seem to be dealing with a version of the levels of selection question that doesn't just take the existence of hierarchical organization for granted. That's not as the starting point, but rather as the very thing to be explained itself. How is it that smaller biological entities came to be nested within larger ones? And part of the answer in some of these transitions is that the individual cells or smaller units more generally were highly related. And so it really, they were prepared to coalesce into a larger unit precisely because they were helping their genetic relatives. So if you think of a single cell that divides, then its offspring, those daughter cells, will not necessarily be identical, depending on the mode of cell division and what exactly goes on, but will be closely related, at least, to their parent cells. So if multicellularity first emerged by the product of a mitosis, a mitotic cell division, the products just not detaching fully, but staying around, so forming a colony of closely related cells, we can in principle use the idea of kin selection to understand why they might have been prepared to work for the good of the whole rather than looking out for themselves. So one idea in some of the evolutionary transitions literature is that really the fundamental principle in many of these transitions is kin selection. But of course, that can't be the principle involved in all of them, because some of the transitions notably things such as the evolution of the first eukaryotic cell, which involved two prokaryotic cell lineages fusing to give rise to a single eukaryotic cell, where the organelles such as the mitochondria in the eukaryotic cell, the descendants of free-living prokaryotes that came to be engulfed within a single larger prokaryote, giving rise to the modern eukaryotic cell. That sort of transition involves unrelated partners coming together, and so is logically quite different to transitions that involve related partners coming together. The labels fraternal and egalitarian have been used by the biologist David Queller to capture this distinction. And it's much harder to see how kinship and relatedness could be the key to understanding those egalitarian transitions. More likely, it's something like division of labor. So the two parties brought different things to the table, and that explained how they could fuse. So really think of it as a sort of logical extreme of symbiosis.
Yeah.
If you like.
The next bit of time I actually wanted to talk about what I started with was, this the evolution of altruism, right? And really, maybe before we get into a discussion about levels of selection and how that might help explain altruism, could you just talk a little bit about why altruism is a problem from an evolutionary standpoint, so that anyone who's listening can get a sense of what is fundamentally the issue here? Why is altruism considered the sticky problem? And then we can get to talking about how levels of selection maybe helps us get around some of the issues.
Okay, good. So, when we talk about altruism in an evolutionary context, we are referring to a behavior of an organism, could be an animal, a plant, a microbe, whatever, that is reduces the organism's own biological fitness. That's to say, its survival and its reproductive success, but enhances that of someone else. So we're not obviously saying that the animal or organism consciously was trying to help someone else, but that their behavior, in fact, is costly for them but benefits others. Immediately, then that raises a question, because you would have thought that Darwinism would lead us to expect that organisms would engage in behaviors that benefit themselves, not others, and that any benefit to others would only be incidental. And you would have thought that selective competition would precisely mean that organisms that didn't behave altruistically, or that behaved selfishly, in other words, would prosper over ones that behave altruistically. And Darwin himself was well aware of this point, and indeed in his 1879 book, The Descent of Man, where he applied his evolutionary ideas to humans, then he discussed the origins of pro-social behavior in early hominids. And Darwin precisely saw the problem when he said, in a famous passage, he said, "He who was ready to sacrifice his life rather than betray his comrades would often leave no offspring to inherit his noble nature." So Darwin is precisely highlighting the anomaly of altruistic behavior from the point of view of his own theory of evolution by natural selection. And so that's the basic reason why this is a puzzle, because we do seem to see it in many taxa. We find organisms doing things that are for the public good, if you like, or for the good of some relative or some other organism, rather than for their own good, which at first blush at least is contrary to what we would expect from fundamental evolutionary principles. So this question of how you ultimately reconcile evolution with the existence of such behavior has long been a fascination for evolutionists from the 1930s onwards, really, particularly from the 60s onwards, and still today, and is intimately connected with the levels of selection issue, as you pointed out.
Right. I think maybe we can talk a little bit about why why a notion such as skin selection, which is an important part of evolution, why that would be insufficient to explain altruism? Because guilt selection
Yeah,
does help explain why someone might do something that benefits someone else that's not themselves, at cost to themselves often. But why would you say that's not sufficient?
absolutely. I mean, I think many people would agree that kin selection is a large part of the story, because although it's difficult to sort of make generalizations that don't have exceptions in biology, I think many people would agree that organisms are more likely to exhibit altruistic behavior towards their kin than their non-kin. And many mammals in particular are extremely good at recognizing, distinguishing kin from non-kin, generally by means of smell. Um, and even in organisms without such powers of kin recognition, typically they'll I mean, given how organisms disperse, then limited dispersal means that many organisms, though not all, will spend more of their life surrounded by kin than by non-kin. So a simple rule of thumb, such as, be nice to the people near you, will in practice mean that it's not too difficult for organisms in which dispersal is limited to direct their behavior, their helping behaviors to their relatives. So I think many people would say, yeah, empirically, there's something right about the idea of kin selection, in that most examples of of altruistic behavior are kin directed, or many at least. And the logical basis for kin selection is very well understood. I mean, the point is simply that in a kin interaction, the altruist and the recipient of the altruism share genes. So therefore, if one imagines a gene that causes its bearer, it's the organism which it is, to behave altruistically, then that could in fact evolve by natural selection, or flourish and be maintained by natural selection, so long as the benefits are directed at other organisms that have a higher than random chance of carrying the gene themselves. That's basically the principle of kin selection. It's what it boils down to. So I think many people would say, yep, that's a large part of the story, but perhaps not all, because as we talked about in relation to these evolutionary transitions, there are cases where organisms appear to behave cooperatively, at least, if not perhaps altruistically, with members of other species and with non-kin, and particularly in the human case. I mean, humans exhibit this remarkable cooperative tendency, in that we form cooperative institutions and organizations with people who are not our kin, perhaps much more so than any other species. Some people indeed think of this as one of the defining marks of what's distinctive about the human species. And so, although I think obviously the basic idea of kin selection may have some explanatory relevance for humans too. I mean, many humans, for example, give much more financial help to relatives than to non-relatives, in many societies at least. I mean, it's clear that human social behavior, is far more complicated than the simple predictions of kin selection would have you believe, or would make you expect. I mean, the culture obviously plays an enormous role in modulating human behavior. So it's not just a question of genes. And because humans form these cooperative networks with unrelated organisms. So for those reasons, I think many people think that kin selection is important, but perhaps not the whole story.
Right. So, given the levels of selection, or an understanding of levels of selection, what can we say about levels at which selection occurs, especially also given what we know maybe about bands of hunter-gatherers who roamed the savannas, all those years back? Is there evidence from those times, or from those small societies, that we can bring to bear to talk about maybe the various levels at which selection might have happened, and how selection have been partitioned across these levels?
Yep. Well, one idea that's out there, I'm not saying it's necessarily true, but it's widely held in some quarters, is that the human species is particularly well suited to group level selection. And so group selection might have played a role in our species that it hasn't done in others. For two reasons. I mean, one is that throughout most of human history, we have indeed lived in relatively small tribes or bands, between which conflict has been common. But secondly, and perhaps more fundamentally, that culture means that human groups can maintain their distinctiveness despite extensive or genetic mixing. So, I mean, the point here, is that one of the big problems for the idea of group selection is that, although in principle it seems conceivable, many people pointed out a long time ago that the variation between groups that you need in order for the process of group selection to work is prone to be eliminated if the groups swap migrants every now and again. And indeed, theoretical work showed a long time ago that, I mean, even a relatively small flow of migrants between reasonably isolated groups in a species will quickly erode the genetic variation between the groups. So then the groups become homogeneous, and then you can't have selection, because for selection you need variation. So this was one of the big problems for the traditional hypothesis of group selection. But where you're dealing with human groups that exhibit cultural differences, it's a striking fact, a well-known fact in demography and anthropology and related social sciences, that enormous cultural variation between human groups is highly resistant to, it is preserved in the face of migration, even substantial migration, precisely because migrants into the community often are required to, or do at least, conform in some respects to the cultural norms that of the place they're migrating into. You know, and that's why you see, for example, I mean, think of the differences in regional accents between cities in the UK, right? I mean, these are not very far apart. It's easier. I mean, you might only be half an hour on the train. Think of Liverpool and Manchester, for example. And yet they retain these remarkable differences that you might have thought, surely they will just be all blended away, but they're not. And so that's an example of the strength of the power of culture to preserve differentiation. And so that then means that in principle, one might have natural selection acting on cultural differences rather than genetic differences. And that one of the logical stumbling blocks for the traditional hypothesis of group selection is removed once we're talking about selection on cultural variation rather than genetic variation.
Right. Yeah, no, I think this is of course, a deeply interesting subject, and we could go on with it. I know that we're almost out of time. I just wanted to, well, I guess I just want to end with something that's a bit speculative. Given that we've spoken about human cooperation and how, it's sort of this, and this cooperation that at a scale that's perhaps not, obvious amongst other species. I don't know. Certainly seems that way. When we think about nation states and cities, this kind of, modern social organization. I mean, from the ideas of levels of selection, cultural selection being an important driver of human societies, especially, is there an application of these ideas to the emergence of cities or nation states, these big structures of human organization that we see? I know it's a very speculative thing, but I just thought we'd end on that.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's an interesting question. Whether an evolutionary framework is the right one for understanding, the emergence of many of these distinctive features of human social organization. I mean, it's sort of tempting to think maybe it is, because at a very abstract level, we're dealing with something that looks a little bit like these evolutionary transitions, perhaps. And some people have wondered whether humans might be sort of partway through some kind of evolutionary transition in which the larger unit would be some sort of network or society, some social unit or something. And so whether these evolutionary principles apply, but I suppose my own view, although I can't back this up with anything decisive, is that something really very different is going on in the human case. That it has its roots in biology, but it's given rise to culture. And although cultural evolution is a reality and can be studied with many of the same tools as biological evolution, that somehow or other the methods of the social sciences and the application of complexity science to social organization and so on involves considerations that are probably unique to the human species. And I'm not so sure that fundamental evolutionary principles are the ones that are going to illuminate what's going on in those cases. So if I were the social scientists who sometimes worry that, evolution, this was a worry in the 80s, particularly with talk of sociobiology, the worry that evolutionary biology would somehow usurp them. I think they've got no need to worry. I think there is something qualitatively distinctive going on in the human case that is probably needs proprietary methods, scientific methods to understand.
Yeah. No, completely get that. And, obviously, human social organization, there are so many other factors, like you mentioned, that
Right.
might not have an equivalent to, the concept straight out of biological evolution. So, yeah.
Exactly.
Well,
there is this. Mm-hmm.
Oh,
sorry, I was just going to say, apropos of that, there is this notion out there that humans have somehow or other transcended evolution. And not in the sense that biological evolution doesn't happen within the human species, it certainly does and must, but that the existence of culture and horizontal information transmission has so fundamentally changed the picture that we're up on a different landscape now.
No, absolutely. So with that, I just wanted to thank you so much, Samir, for taking the time and working with us through all the tech disasters that we had. Really appreciate all your time, and I think it was a wonderful conversation.
Not at all. My pleasure. Thank you very much, Anand.